The town square of Redemption Gulch was suffocating under the weight of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Red dust hung thick in the blistering afternoon heat, swirling with each angry shout from the mob. On a hastily assembled wooden scaffold at the center of the square stood a Comanche man, his long black hair falling past his shoulders, his copper skin darkened by decades under the unforgiving sun. His arms were bound cruelly tight behind his back with hemp rope that bit into his flesh. Around his neck, a coarse noose had been drawn taut, the knot resting just below his right ear. His obsidian eyes held a strange serenity, as if he had already accepted what was to come. The crowd below had no understanding of what they were about to do. The man they prepared to execute was not some common horse thief or murderer. He was Takowin, war chief of the Comanche, a leader whose word commanded the loyalty of 3,000 warriors scattered across the plains. If the rope tightened and his body fell, those warriors would paint their faces black and ride until Redemption Gulch was nothing but ash in memory. Below the gallows, the townspeople screamed themselves hoarse. A man in a tattered vest hurled a whiskey bottle that shattered against the scaffold steps, glass exploding in all directions. An elderly woman in widow's black shrieked above the din, her voice cracking with grief and rage. Hang the savage. He butchered the Calloway boy. Blood demands blood. The roar that followed her words surged like floodwater breaking through a dam, drowning out any voice of reason that might have existed in that frenzied mass. No one questioned the convenient evidence. No one wondered why the murdered boy's silver pocket watch was found in Takowin's possession, gleaming and unstained despite the brutal violence of the killing. No one asked why Comanche war paint had been smeared on the rocks near the body in patterns that no true warrior would ever use. They needed someone to blame, needed an outlet for their fear and hatred, and they had their savage standing right there before them, rope already around his neck. In the shadows at the edge of the square stood Marcus Blackwood, a solitary figure leaning against the weathered post of the general store. Marcus rarely concerned himself with the town's bloodlust. He had seen too many hangings, too much frontier justice that had nothing to do with actual justice at all. But when his eyes drifted upward and locked onto the condemned man's face, something stirred in the depths of his chest, something he had thought long dead. Those were not the eyes of a killer. They were the eyes of a leader who had walked through fire and come out the other side, still standing. Eyes that had seen battle and loss and hardship, but had never surrendered to cruelty or madness. Marcus knew those eyes. He had looked into them before, years ago, under very different circumstances. On the far side of the square, half hidden in the shadows of the Assay office balcony, stood Edmund Graves. The wealthiest man in the territory, Graves owned the largest cattle operation for 200 miles, controlled the water rights to 3 rivers, and held the mineral claims to half the mountains surrounding the valley. His tailored black suit was immaculate despite the dust, his silver-handled cane resting casually against the railing. A cold smile played at the corners of his thin lips as he watched the proceedings below. No one in the crowd knew that Graves had orchestrated this entire spectacle. No one understood that the Calloway boy's death was just the opening move in a game that would end with Graves controlling every acre of Comanche land, every water source, every mountain pass. When the rope tightened and the chief fell, the inevitable war would give the government the excuse it needed to force the Comanche off their ancestral grounds. And when the dust settled, Edmund Graves would be there with his lawyers and his money, ready to claim it all. Thank you for allowing me the honor of sharing this tale with you tonight. Let me know where you're tuning in from, wherever you may be. I wish you peace and a quiet heart. Marcus Blackwood stood perfectly still, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before him. People called him the Ghost Rider, a man who appeared and disappeared like smoke, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or make connections. 20 years ago, Marcus had served as a cavalry scout on the frontier. He had ridden with both soldiers and peaceful tribes, had learned to speak the Comanche tongue, had shared meals and stories with warriors who became his brothers in all but blood. He knew Takowin well. The silver-haired chief before him was no mindless killer, no savage hungry for white blood. Takawin had always been a voice of moderation among his people, had argued for coexistence, had sent peace delegations even when the young warriors called for war. He had tried to find a way forward that would allow his children and grandchildren to live on the land their ancestors had walked for generations. But the hunger of white expansion was louder than any promise, stronger than any treaty. And now here stood Takawin, displayed like a trophy before a howling mob, condemned for a crime Marcus knew he could never have committed. In the distance, Edmund Graves stood motionless on his balcony, surveying the chaos with the detached satisfaction of a chess master watching his pieces move across the board. The town saw Graves as their savior, the man who had brought prosperity and opportunity to this hardscrabble corner of the frontier. They did not see the wolf beneath the fine clothes, the predator who would sacrifice 100 lives without hesitation if it meant adding another 1,000 acres to his empire. Marcus knew the truth. He had seen the survey maps in Graves' office during a poker game 6 months ago, had glimpsed the red boundaries marking Comanche territory and the notations about water rights and mineral deposits. Graves needed the Comanche gone, and he needed a reason that would satisfy the government and the army. The death of a popular young settler was exactly the spark required. The Callaway boy had been found 3 days ago at the edge of Comanche lands, his body bearing the marks of a vicious attack. Next to him lay a Comanche knife, blood still wet on the blade, and nearby someone had painted war symbols on the rocks in the crude, garish style that existed only in dime novels and the imaginations of people who had never actually seen a Comanche warrior prepare for battle. It was too perfect, too convenient. The kind of manufactured crime scene that could only be the work of someone who understood how to manipulate fear and anger into useful tools. Marcus glanced back toward Takawin. The old chief stood with his shoulders squared, his breathing slow and measured, not fighting against the rope or begging for mercy. That kind of dignity, that kind of internal strength belonged only to someone who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to fear. Marcus remembered the last time they had spoken at a peace conference near the Canadian River 2 years ago. Takawin had clasped his forearm and said, "The world is changing, my friend. Soon there will be no place for men like us, men who remember when honor meant something more than money. When that day comes, you must decide whether you will stand with the wolves or protect the last of the true people." Now, watching that same man stand beneath the hangman's noose, Marcus felt those words echo through his skull like thunder. He had spent the last 20 years drifting, avoiding commitment, telling himself that the frontier's problems were not his problems. But if he stayed silent now, if he let this travesty proceed, he would lose more than just an old friend. He would lose whatever remained of his soul. The drumbeat began, slow and measured, each strike like a nail being driven into a coffin. The executioner, a thick-necked man with meaty hands and dead eyes, moved into position beside the lever that would drop the trapdoor. He was waiting only for the signal from Judge Harrington, who stood on the platform in his black robes, looking for all the world like some biblical figure about to pronounce divine judgment. The crowd pressed closer, their voices rising in a chant that had no words, only rage and bloodlust. "Do it! Do it! Do it!" They stamped their feet in rhythm with the drum, creating a thunder that shook the wooden buildings around the square. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, and the stench of unwashed bodies and cheap whiskey filled the air with a nauseating thickness. One more moment, and the rope would turn a tribal leader into a corpse swinging in the wind. One more moment, and thousands of warriors would learn that their chief had been murdered by white men's justice. One more moment, and the valley would drown in blood. In that sea of madness, Marcus stood frozen, his hand resting on the worn grip of the Colt revolver at his hip. He looked up at Takawin one more time, and in that instant, their eyes met. The chief's expression did not change, but something passed between them, a silent understanding that transcended words. "You know I am innocent. You know this is murder dressed up as law. You know what will happen if you let this proceed." Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs. A voice in his head, whether his own conscience or some ghost from his past, spoke with absolute clarity. "If you stay silent now, If you let this happen, you will carry this weight until the day you die. You will see his face every time you close your eyes. You will hear the rope creak and the crowd cheer, and you will know that you chose cowardice over honor. Suddenly, Edmund Graves stepped forward to the edge of his balcony, raising his silver-topped cane for attention. His voice rang out across the square with practiced authority, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Citizens of Redemption Gulch, today we bear witness to justice. The Calloway boy has been avenged, and from this day forward, the savages will know that this land belongs to civilization, to progress, to us. The crowd erupted in a frenzy of approval, boots stomping so hard that dust rose in clouds, fists pumping in the air, voices rising in a wordless howl of triumph. The hangman gripped the lever with both hands, muscles tensing, preparing to yank it down and send Takawin plummeting to his death. Marcus moved without thinking. His hand closed on his revolver, his thumb pulled back the hammer, and he raised the weapon high above his head. The crack of the gunshot split the air like lightning, echoing off the buildings, momentarily drowning out even the roar of the mob. "Stop!" Marcus's voice was raw and commanding, cutting through the chaos like a blade. The entire square seemed to freeze, hundreds of faces turning toward him in confusion and anger. The executioner's hand hesitated on the lever, and Judge Harrington looked down from the gallows with narrowed eyes. Marcus stepped forward, pushing through the crowd, his revolver still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. People scrambled back from him, fear overriding their bloodlust. They knew Marcus Blackwood's reputation. They knew he was not a man to be trifled with, not someone who made empty threats or wasted bullets. "He didn't kill the boy," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the now silent square. "You've all been played for fools. The knife, the paint, the watch, all of it was planted. Someone wanted you to hang an innocent man, and you were so eager for blood that you never stopped to ask why." The crowd stirred uneasily, confusion beginning to crack through their certainty. But then a voice from near the gallows shouted back, "You're defending a redskin? Have you lost your mind, Blackwood?" Others took up the cry, "He's a traitor! Shoot them both. The savage killed the Calloway boy. We all know it." Judge Harrington raised his gavel, face flushed with indignation. "Mr. Blackwood, you are interfering with lawful execution of justice. Stand down immediately or face arrest yourself." Marcus took another step forward, and the crowd parted before him like water. His gray eyes were cold as winter ice, his jaw set in a hard line. "This isn't justice, Your Honor. This is a lynching dressed up with legal papers. And if that rope tightens, every Comanche warrior from here to the Stake Plains will ride down on this town and burn it to the ground. Is that what you want?" A ripple of uncertainty passed through the assembled townspeople. Some of them, the ones old enough to remember the last Comanche raids, felt a cold finger of fear touch their spines. They remembered what happened when you killed a chief, how the retaliation could be swift and merciless. Edmund Graves' voice cut through the growing doubt like a knife. "Don't listen to him. Blackwood is a known sympathizer, a man who has more loyalty to savages than to his own kind. Proceed with the execution, Judge Harrington." Now, the executioner moved to pull the lever, but Marcus was already moving. He fired another shot, this time splintering the wooden handle of the lever itself, sending the executioner stumbling backward with a yelp of surprise. Marcus took the gallows steps 3 at a time, his boots hammering on the wood, and before anyone could react, he had his knife out and was sawing through the rope around Takawin's neck. The hemp strands parted with a snap, and Takawin staggered forward, gasping, his hands still bound behind his back. Marcus caught him, steadied him, and with 2 quick cuts freed his arms as well. The crowd was roaring now, a sound of pure fury and confusion, but Marcus had his revolver out again, sweeping it across the mass of people below. "Anyone who wants to try me is welcome to step up," he called out, his voice steady despite the thunder of his pulse in his ears. "But the first one who moves is the first one who dies." For a long moment, the square hung in perfect balance between violence and restraint. Then a rifle shot cracked from somewhere in the crowd, the bullet slamming into the gallows post inches from Marcus's head, sending splinters flying. The fragile piece shattered like glass. Marcus grabbed Takawin by the arm and half-dragged, half-carried him toward the back of the platform. More gunshots erupted, bullets whining through the air, thudding into wood. The crowd scattered in panic, people diving for cover, screaming, trampling each other in their haste to escape the crossfire. Marcus and Takawin dropped off the back of the gallows, landing hard in the dust. Marcus's horse, a big roan gelding with a white blaze, was tied at the hitching post behind the general store. They ran, bent low, as bullets chewed up the ground around them. Marcus could hear Takawin's ragged breathing, could see the raw red rope burn, encircling his throat like a collar of blood. They reached the horse, and Marcus practically threw Takawin into the saddle before swinging up behind him. He kicked the roan into a gallop, and they thundered down the alley behind the buildings, taking the back way out of town. Behind them, the chaos continued, shouts and gunfire and the sound of breaking glass. From his balcony, Edmund Graves watched them go, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he turned to his foreman, a scarred man named Pike, and said quietly, "Let them run. In fact, make sure no one follows too closely. The more chaos we have, the easier this becomes. By tomorrow, the Comanche will believe their chief was hanged, and when they attack, we'll have everything we need." Pike nodded and disappeared down the stairs to carry out his orders. Graves remained on the balcony, watching the dust cloud raised by Marcus's horse fade into the distance. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Better, even. Now he had a white man aiding and abetting the enemy, which would make the eventual military response even more decisive. Marcus and Takawin rode hard for an hour, pushing the roan to its limits, before finally slowing as they entered a narrow canyon cut deep into the Red Rock Hills. Marcus pulled the horse to a stop in the shadow of an overhanging cliff and helped Takawin down. The chief collapsed against the rock wall, his legs shaking, his breathing harsh and labored. Marcus knelt beside him and offered his canteen. "Drink slowly. Catch your breath. Then you need to tell me everything." Takawin took the canteen with trembling hands and drank deeply, water spilling down his chin and neck, washing away some of the dust. When he finally lowered the canteen, his dark eyes met Marcus's, and for the first time since the gallows, Marcus saw something other than calm acceptance there. He saw rage, and beneath that a deep weariness. "This was a trap from the beginning," Takawin said, his voice hoarse from the rope's pressure on his throat. "I came to Redemption Gulch because I received a message saying the town council wanted to discuss a peace treaty, wanted to establish boundaries that both our peoples could respect. I rode in with only 2 warriors as escorts, as a sign of good faith. But when we arrived, soldiers were waiting. They arrested us immediately, said the Calloway boy had been murdered, and evidence pointed to me." "What happened to your escorts?" Marcus asked. "Dead. Shot down in the street before they could even draw weapons. The soldiers claimed they were resisting arrest." Takawin's jaw clenched. Everything was prepared in advance. They'd already built the gallows. The trial lasted less than an hour. The judge had clearly made his decision before any testimony was heard. And the evidence, Marcus, it was absurd. A knife that no Comanche warrior would carry. War paint in patterns that exist only in white men's imaginations. But the townspeople wanted blood, and I was convenient. Marcus sat back on his heels, his mind racing. The pieces were falling into place now, revealing a picture that was even uglier than he had imagined. "Graves," he said, "Edmund Graves is behind all of this. He wants Comanche land, wants the water rights and the mineral claims. He needed a war, needed an excuse for the army to clear you out. So he arranged for the boy's murder, planted evidence, and set you up to be the spark that would ignite everything." Takawin closed his eyes, his expression hardening. "How many of my people will die because of one man's greed? How many of the townspeople will die when your warriors come for revenge?" Marcus countered, "Because you know they're already writing. Word of your execution is probably spreading across the plains right now. By this time tomorrow, Redemption Gulch will be under siege." "I know. Takawin's voice was heavy with the weight of that knowledge, and I cannot stop it. Even if I returned and showed myself alive, my warriors would not believe the town did not try to kill me. They would see the rope burn on my neck and demand blood in return. And the townspeople, seeing Comanche warriors approaching, would assume they were under attack and begin shooting. One way or another, Graves will get his war. Marcus stood up, pacing back and forth in the confined space of the canyon, his mind working through possibilities and probabilities. Then we need to expose him. We need to prove that Graves orchestrated the Calloway boys' murder, that he framed you deliberately. If we can show both sides the truth, maybe we can stop this before it becomes a bloodbath. Ow! Takawin asked, skepticism clear in his voice. No one will believe us. To the townspeople, I am a convicted murderer. To my own warriors, I will be a chief who survived while my escorts died. In the eyes of both peoples, we are tainted. Maybe, Marcus admitted, but I know Graves. He's arrogant, confident in his own cleverness. Men like that keep records, keep proof of their schemes because they can't resist documenting their own brilliance. If we can get into his office, into his private papers, we might find something we can use. Takawin shook his head slowly. That would require going back to Redemption Gulch, back to the heart of enemy territory. They will be looking for us. Every man in town will have a gun and orders to shoot on sight. I know, Marcus said, but I don't see another option. Do you? The two men looked at each other in the fading afternoon light, the shadows growing longer around them. They both understood the reality of their situation. They were trapped between two forces, each convinced of its righteousness, each prepared to unleash violence on the other. The only way out was to strike at the source, to cut off the head of the serpent before it could finish swallowing the valley whole. We wait until nightfall, Marcus said finally. Rest now. You're going to need your strength. Takawin nodded slowly and closed his eyes, his breathing gradually steadying. Marcus sat down with his back against the canyon wall and pulled out his revolver, checking the loads, cleaning the mechanism with practiced hands. He had walked away from this life, had told himself he was done with violence and conflict and choosing sides. But here he was again, drawn back by forces he could not resist. Maybe Takawin had been right 2 years ago. Maybe there was no place left for men like them. Men who remembered when a handshake meant something, when honor was worth more than gold. But if that was true, if they really were the last of a dying breed, then perhaps the best thing they could do was go down fighting, taking the wolves with them. Thank you for staying with me through this tale. If this story has moved you, if it has reminded you of something important, I invite you to let me know. Your presence here means more than you might realize. Bad news travels faster than wildfire on a dry prairie. Before the sun had set on the day of the failed hanging, riders were already galloping along the old trails that connected Comanche camps across hundreds of miles of territory. The message they carried was simple and devastating. Chief Takawin had been hanged by the white men of Redemption Gulch. The great leader, the voice of wisdom and restraint, had been murdered in the public square like a common criminal. No one mentioned that he had been saved. No one knew that Marcus Blackwood had cut the rope and spirited him away. All they knew was that their chief had been taken prisoner, had been tried and convicted, had stood with a noose around his neck, while white settlers cheered for his death. That alone was enough to set the plains ablaze with rage. By dawn the next morning, war councils were being held in every Comanche camp within a day's ride of Redemption Gulch. Young warriors who had long chafed under Takawin's insistence on peace now saw their chance. They painted their faces with the black and red of war, sharpened their weapons, prepared their fastest horses. The older warriors, the ones who remembered the cost of war with the white men, tried to counsel restraint, but their voices were drowned out by the drums and the war cries. Within 24 hours, more than 2,000 warriors had assembled on the hills overlooking Redemption Gulch, a force larger than any seen in the territory for a generation. They came from 6 different bands, united in their grief and fury. Some carried rifles taken in past raids. Others bore traditional weapons, bows, lances, war clubs. All of them were prepared to die if necessary, prepared to make the white settlers pay for what they had done. In Redemption Gulch itself, panic spread like cholera. Lookouts on the hills had spotted the gathering Comanche forces, and word raced through the town faster than thought. Within hours, the entire community was in motion. Men who had never fired a gun in anger were suddenly drilling in the street, learning how to load and aim. Women and children were being evacuated to the stone church, the only building sturdy enough to withstand a sustained attack. Wagons were overturned and used to create barricades across Main Street. Sandbags were filled and stacked in front of windows. Every rifle, pistol, and shotgun in town was distributed to anyone old enough to hold one. The general store was cleaned out of ammunition in less than an hour. People who had been neighbors for years suddenly looked at each other with fear and suspicion, wondering who would break first when the attack came. Judge Harrington stood in the center of the square, his voice booming across the frightened crowd. "We will not flee. We will not surrender. This is our land, paid for with blood and sweat and the courage of pioneers. The savages want to drive us out, want to return this valley to wilderness and barbarism, but we will stand firm. We will defend Redemption Gulch to our last breath." The crowd responded with a cheer, but it was a hollow sound, brittle with fear. They all knew what was coming. They had all heard the stories of Comanche raids, of the speed and ferocity of the warriors, of what happened to settlements that fell. Many of them were already mentally preparing for death. In the hills above the town, a young warrior named Running Wolf stood at the edge of the gathering war party, his face painted black from forehead to chin, his bow strung and ready. He had been one of Takawin's most loyal followers, had believed in the old chief's vision of peace. But that was before the white men had shown their true nature, before they had hanged his leader like a dog. Now Running Wolf's heart burned with a rage so pure it felt almost holy. He wanted to ride down on Redemption Gulch like a storm, wanted to make the settlers feel the same terror and helplessness that Takawin must have felt standing on that gallows. He wanted to paint the streets red and leave nothing standing but ashes and ghosts. Beside him, an older warrior named Gray Bear laid a restraining hand on his shoulder. "Control yourself, young one. Anger makes a man careless, makes him easy to kill. If we attack with discipline and strategy, not blind rage." Discipline? Running Wolf spat. Strategy? They murdered our chief. They deserve no mercy, no honor in combat. They deserve to be wiped from the earth. "Perhaps," Gray Bear said quietly. "But if we attack this town, the army will come. Not a patrol, not a detachment, but a full regiment. They will hunt us across the plains, will pursue us until we are scattered like seeds in the wind." Is that what Takawin would have wanted? Is it the legacy you wish to create? Running Wolf had no answer for that, but his hands remained clenched tight on his bow, his jaw set in a hard line. Around them, the war party continued to grow, warriors arriving from camps as far as 3 days' ride away, all of them drawn by news of the chief's death. In a narrow canyon several miles from both the Comanche forces and the town, Marcus and Takawin prepared for the night ahead. The chief's strength had returned somewhat, though the rope burn on his neck was angry and inflamed, and he moved with the careful precision of someone in significant pain. Marcus had scouted the surrounding area during the day and brought back disturbing news. "There are at least 2,000 warriors on the hills above town," he reported, "maybe more arriving by the hour. And the townspeople are fortifying like they're expecting the end of the world. Both sides are convinced they're about to be attacked. One gunshot, one nervous mistake, and this whole valley becomes a killing ground." Takawin nodded slowly, unsurprised. "My warriors believe they are avenging my death. The settlers believe they're defending their homes from savages. Both believe they are righteous. Both are being manipulated by a man who cares for nothing but profit. Then we go tonight," Marcus said. "We slip into town, get into Graves' office, find the evidence we need. With proof of his guilt, maybe we can stop this before it starts. And if we cannot find proof, if Graves has been more careful than you believe." Marcus checked his revolvers, his jaw tight. "Then we improvise. But one way or another, we have to try." They waited until full darkness had fallen, until the moon was nothing but a thin crescent barely visible through scattered clouds. Then they moved, two shadows slipping through the night like ghosts. Marcus knew the land around Redemption Gulch intimately, knew every canyon and wash, every game trail and hidden path. He led them in a wide circle around the town's southern edge, avoiding the main roads where sentries would be posted. It took them 2 hours to reach the outskirts of town, moving slowly and carefully, pausing frequently to listen and watch. The town itself was lit up like a festival, torches and lanterns burning in every window, nervous guards patrolling the barricades. But Marcus knew the blind spots, knew where the old mining tunnels came up beneath the assay office, knew that Graves' private office on the second floor had a window that opened onto a flat roof one could reach from the adjacent building. They crept through the shadows behind the buildings, staying low, moving only when the guard were looking the other way. Takawin moved with the fluid silence of a man who had spent his life hunting, his moccasins making no sound on the packed earth. They reached the back of the general store, and Marcus led them up a rickety external staircase to the roof. From there, they could see Graves' office window, still lit from within. Through the glass, Marcus could make out the cattle baron's silhouette pacing back and forth, apparently in conversation with someone. They waited, crouched on the roof, as minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, the light in the office went out. They waited another 10 minutes. Then Marcus carefully crossed the narrow gap between buildings, his boots finding purchase on the tar paper and wood shingles. He jimmied the window open with his knife and slipped inside, Takawin following close behind. The office was large and well-appointed, with heavy wooden furniture, expensive rugs, and walls lined with bookshelves. A large desk dominated one corner, its surface covered with papers and ledgers. Marcus struck a match and lit a small lamp, keeping the flame low. They began searching quickly and methodically. Marcus went through the desk drawers while Takawin checked the bookshelves and filing cabinets. For several minutes, they found nothing but routine business correspondence, cattle tallies, and shipping manifests. Then Marcus pulled out a locked drawer at the bottom of the desk. He used his knife to pry it open, the wood splintering with a crack that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet room. Inside were several leather-bound journals and a stack of documents tied with string. Marcus opened the top journal and began reading by lamplight. His expression hardened with each page. The journal detailed Graves' plan in meticulous detail, hiring men to kill the Callaway boy and stage the scene to implicate the Comanche, bribing officials to ensure Takawin received word of the false peace conference, arranging for the chief's escorts to be killed resisting arrest. There were also contracts, agreements with government officials and military officers, documents that showed Graves had already negotiated to purchase Comanche lands once they were seized by the government. The price listed was a fraction of the true value, a theft disguised as a legal transaction. "This is it," Marcus whispered urgently to Takawin. "This is everything we need. Proof that Graves orchestrated the whole thing. Proof of his conspiracy with government men. With these documents, we can expose him, show both your people and the townspeople the truth." But as he spoke, the office door suddenly swung open and lamplight flooded in. Edmund Graves stood in the doorway, a derringer in his hand, pointed directly at Marcus's chest. Behind him were 4 of his hired guns, all armed with rifles. "I thought you might come," Graves said calmly, his thin lips curving into a cold smile. "Men like you are so predictable, Blackwood, always thinking you can be the hero, always believing that truth and justice matter. It would be almost admirable if it weren't so pathetically naive." Marcus slowly raised his hands, the journal still clutched in his right hand. Takawin stood frozen beside him, his eyes moving from Graves to the hired guns, calculating odds that were clearly hopeless. "You're not going to get away with this," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at his heart. "Those documents prove everything. They prove you murdered an innocent boy, framed an innocent man, tried to start a war for profit." "Oh, I know what they prove," Graves said. "That's why I kept them, you see, as insurance, as leverage if certain government officials decided they wanted a larger share of the profits. But I certainly never intended for them to fall into the hands of a broken-down scout and a savage chieftain. That would be inconvenient." He gestured with the derringer. "Put the journal down, Blackwood." Slowly, and step away from a desk. Marcus hesitated, his mind racing through possibilities. The window behind them was still open, but they would never make it before the guns cut them down. The hired guns were spread out across the doorway, professionals who knew their business. There was no way out that didn't end in blood. "Put it down," Graves repeated, his voice hardening, "or I'll shoot the savage first, and you can watch him die before I kill you." Slowly, reluctantly, Marcus set the journal back on the desk. As he did, he caught Takawin's eye, saw the chief give an almost imperceptible nod. They both understood. If they were going to die, they would die fighting, taking as many of Graves' men with them as possible. But before either of them could move, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Graves." Everyone in the room turned toward the window. Standing on the roof outside, silhouetted against the night sky, was a woman in men's clothing. Canvas pants, a work shirt, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat. She held a Winchester rifle at her shoulder, the barrel pointed steadily at Graves' head. "Drop the gun," she said calmly. "Tell your men to lower their rifles, or I'll paint your office walls with what's left of your brain." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Graves laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who's been watching you for longer than you know," the woman replied. "Someone who knows exactly what you are and what you've done. Now drop the gun. This is your last warning." Marcus recognized her voice, though it took him a moment to place it. Sarah Calloway, the sister of the murdered boy. Graves' face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks like water from a broken barrel. His hand wavered slightly, the derringer trembling. He had not expected this, had not planned for the dead boy's sister to appear like an avenging angel at his window. Sarah climbed through the window with practiced ease, never letting the rifle's aim drift from Graves' head. Up close, Marcus could see she was in her mid-20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical braid, green eyes hard as stones, and sun-weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. She moved like someone comfortable with weapons, comfortable with danger. "I said drop it," she repeated, and this time there was no mistaking the deadly serious intent in her voice. Graves let the derringer fall from his fingers. It clattered on the wooden floor with a sound like a death knell. "Your brother," he began, but Sarah cut him off with a sharp gesture. "My brother was murdered by your men. I know that now. Took me a while to figure it out, but I got there eventually." Her voice was tight with controlled rage. "Tom wasn't the brightest boy, but he was good. He wouldn't have gone near Comanche territory alone, not at night. But he would have gone if someone he trusted told him there was work to be had, money to be made." "You can't prove," Graves started. "I can prove plenty," Sarah interrupted. "I've been watching your operation for weeks now, ever since Tom died. Followed your man Pike when he rode out to meet with those government officials. Listen outside windows. Paid attention. I know you hired men to kill my brother and stage the scene. I know you framed the Comanche chief. I know everything." She glanced at Marcus and Takawin, her expression softening slightly. "When I heard what you did at the gallows, Mr. Blackwood, I knew you were the only man in this territory with enough backbone to stand up to Graves. So I've been following you, waiting for the right moment." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a strange mixture of relief and renewed hope. "Then you'll testify? You'll tell people what you know?" "Better than that," Sarah said. She reached into her shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I broke into Pike's room at the boarding house 3 days ago. Found this letter from Graves, giving explicit instructions for Tom's murder and the staging of evidence. Signed in his own hand." Graves lunged for her, desperation overriding his caution, but Sarah swung the rifle and cracked him across the jaw with the barrel. He went down hard, blood streaming from his split lip. The hired guns started to raise their weapons, but Sarah had already trained the Winchester back on them. "Don't," she said flatly. "I've got nothing left to lose, and I'll happily send every one of you to hell before you can pull those triggers." The hired guns looked at each other, looked at Graves bleeding on the floor, and slowly lowered their rifles. They were professionals, and professionals knew when the game was up. Marcus moved quickly, gathering up the journals and documents from the desk, stuffing them inside his shirt. Takawin picked up one of the dropped rifles and covered the hired guns while Sarah kept her Winchester trained on Graves. We need to get this evidence to both sides, Marcus said urgently. To the Comanche warriors and to the town. Before sunrise, before someone fires the first shot and this whole thing explodes. The Comanche won't listen, one of the hired guns muttered. They think their chief is dead. They're out for blood. Takawin spoke for the first time, his voice rough but strong. They will listen when they see me alive. When they see proof of the white man's treachery came not from all whites, but from one greedy coward. The truth can still prevent war, but only if we act quickly. Sarah nodded sharply. Then let's move. We'll take Graves with us, show him to the crowd, make him confess in front of everyone. They bound Graves and his men with rope from the office, gagged them to prevent shouting for help. Then Marcus, Takawin, and Sarah slipped back out the window and down to the street, moving through the shadows toward the edge of town. The night was deep now, the darkest hours before dawn when the world seems to hold its breath. They made their way to the northern edge of Redemption Gulch, where the barricades faced toward the hills where the Comanche war party waited. Sentries paced nervously along the makeshift fortifications, their rifles clutched tight, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of attack. Marcus cupped his hand around his mouth and called out, "Hold your fire. I'm Marcus Blackwood, and I'm coming in with proof that will stop this war." The sentries whipped around, guns raising, but Judge Harrington emerged from a nearby building, his face haggard with lack of sleep. "Blackwood, is it you? By God, man, you're wanted for treason. Seize him." "Wait." Sarah stepped forward into the torchlight, her face visible. "Judge Harrington, it's me, Sarah Calloway. I have proof that my brother's murder was not committed by the Comanche. I have proof that Edmund Graves orchestrated the entire thing." The judge's face went slack with shock. "Sarah, what are you doing here? What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the truth, Your Honor. The truth about who really killed Tom, and why, and what's been done to this whole territory." She held up the letter, her hand steady. "I have a signed confession from Graves, detailing his plans to start a war so he could steal Comanche land. I've also been following Mr. Blackwood and the chief here, and I can tell you that everything they've said is true." Takawin stepped forward into the circle of torchlight, and a gasp went through the assembled settlers. Some raised their guns again, but others simply stared in shock at the rope burn around his neck, at the living proof that their condemned man had survived. "I am Takawin," the chief said, his voice carrying across the square with the authority of a man born to lead. "I came to your town seeking peace. I was betrayed, framed for a murder I did not commit, nearly killed for a crime that was designed to destroy both our peoples. But I stand here now, alive, and I tell you this. The true enemy is not the Comanche. The true enemy is greed that wears the mask of civilization." Judge Harrington looked from face to face, his expression torn between disbelief and dawning horror. "If this is true, if Graves really did, my God, we've been played for fools." "Worse than fools," Marcus said grimly. "You've been turned into weapons. Both sides have. And if we don't act right now, if we don't show both your people and the Comanche warriors the truth, this valley is going to run red with blood by sunrise." The judge seemed to age 10 years in the space of a heartbeat. He looked at the letters Sarah held, at the rope burn on Takawin's neck, at Marcus's determined face. Finally, he nodded slowly. "What do you need from us?" "Send riders to the Comanche lines under a white flag," Marcus said. "Tell them their chief lives. Tell them we have proof of who really committed the murder. Ask them to send representatives to hear the truth. And gather the townspeople here, all of them. Everyone needs to hear this at the same time." The judge turned and began barking orders. Riders were selected. White cloths were tied to poles, and within minutes, 3 men were galloping toward the hills where the Comanche war party waited. Behind them, the church bell began to ring, its urgent clamor rousing people from their homes and defensive positions. The town square filled rapidly with frightened, confused settlers. They came armed, suspicious, many of them looking at Takawin with open hostility despite his obvious wounds. Marcus could feel the tension crackling in the air like lightning before a storm. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and the powder keg would explode. On the hills above, The Comanche warriors saw the riders approaching under the white flag and held their fire. Running Wolf wanted to shoot them down, wanted to punish the treachery of the whites, but Gray Bear stopped him with a firm hand. "They come in peace," the older warriors said. "We will hear what they have to say." Takawin would have done the same. The riders reached the Comanche lines and delivered their message. "The chief lives, proof of treachery exists. Come to the town and hear the truth." The warriors looked at each other in confusion and disbelief. Their chief alive? How could that be? They had been told he was hanged, had seen no evidence to contradict that story. But the possibility, however remote, that Takawin might still live was too important to ignore. Gray Bear selected 20 warriors to accompany him, including Running Wolf. They would ride to the town, hear what the whites had to say, and make their judgment. If it was a trap, they would die fighting. If it was truth, then perhaps the spirits were not yet done with them. As the sun began to lighten the eastern horizon, turning the sky from black to deep purple, the Comanche delegation rode slowly into Redemption Gulch. The townspeople watched them come with a mixture of fear and uncertainty, guns held ready but not yet raised. The warriors rode with rigid dignity, their faces painted for war, their weapons in hand but not aimed. They stopped in the center of the square, and Gray Bear dismounted. His eyes swept across the assembled crowd, taking in the barricades, the armed settlers, the signs of preparation for battle. Then his gaze fell on Takawin, standing beside Marcus and Sarah, and the old warrior's expression transformed from suspicion to shock to overwhelming relief. "My chief," Gray Bear said, his voice breaking slightly, "we thought you dead. We came to avenge you." Takawin stepped forward, embracing the older warrior briefly before turning to face both the townspeople and his own warriors. When he spoke, his voice carried across the square with perfect clarity. "I was meant to die. I was meant to hang from the gallows, an innocent man convicted of a crime designed to ignite war between our peoples. But I was saved by this man, Marcus Blackwood, who saw through the lies and risked everything to cut the rope from my neck. And now we stand here together, Comanche and settler, to reveal the truth about what was done to us." He gestured to Sarah, who stepped forward holding the letter and the journals. "This woman lost her brother, just as you believed you had lost me. But she did not let grief blind her to truth. She investigated, followed the trail of lies back to its source. And what she found will make your blood run cold." Sarah began to read from the documents, her voice clear and steady. She read Graves' instructions for the murder. She read his negotiations with corrupt officials for the purchase of Comanche land. She read his calculations of profit, his cold assessment that a few deaths, both white and Comanche, were acceptable losses in pursuit of wealth. As she read, the crowd's mood shifted. The hostility toward Takawin began to transform into shame and anger. But now the anger was directed where it belonged, toward the man who had manipulated them all, who had murdered one of their own and tried to start a war for nothing but greed. Running Wolf listened to the words with growing rage, but it was a different kind of rage now. Not the blind fury that had driven him to paint his face and prepare for battle, but a cold, focused anger directed at the real enemy. When Sarah finished reading, he spoke up, his young voice carrying across the square. "Where's this man Graves? Where is the coward who kills children and hides behind the blood of others?" In his office, bound and guarded, Marcus answered, "We can bring him here, make him face what he's done." Judge Harrington stepped forward, his face grave. "Bring him. Let him answer for his crimes before God and man." 10 minutes later, Edmund Graves was dragged into the square, his hands tied behind his back, his face bruised from Sarah's rifle strike. He looked around at the assembled crowd with undisguised contempt, even now refusing to show fear or remorse. "You're all fools," he spat. "Every one of you. I gave you jobs, gave you prosperity, gave this worthless patch of dirt a reason to exist. And this is how you repay me? By listening to a savage and a broken-down scout?" "You killed my brother," Sarah said, her voice shaking with fury. "You killed him and blamed innocent people. You tried to start a war that would have killed hundreds, maybe thousands, all so you could steal land and sell it for profit. Your brother was a means to an end, Graves said with chilling casualness. A tool, nothing more. His death served a purpose, would have served a greater purpose if you hadn't interfered. This territory needs strong men, men willing to do what's necessary to bring civilization to the wilderness. Your brother, the chief, all of you, you're just obstacles to progress. The crowd erupted in anger, both settlers and Comanche warriors shouting their rage. Several people surged forward, and for a moment it looked like Graves would be torn apart by the mob. But Takawin raised his hand, his voice cutting through the chaos. No, he wants us to become monsters like him. Wants us to prove that violence is the only language we speak. But we are better than that. We are people who value justice, who respect law. Let him face trial. Let him answer for his crimes in the proper way. That is how we show we are truly civilized. The crowd subsided, though the anger still crackled in the air like heat from forge. Judge Harrington nodded slowly. The chief is right. Graves will face trial for murder, conspiracy, and attempted genocide. And I promise you all, on my honor, that justice will be served. As the sun fully rose over the eastern mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and rose, the crisis passed. The Comanche warriors returned to their camps with word that their chief lived, that the whites had not killed him, that the true enemy had been found and would be punished. The settlers of Redemption Gulch returned to their homes, shaken by how close they had come to disaster, humbled by the realization of how easily they had been manipulated. Marcus, Takawin, and Sarah stood together in the empty square as the crowd dispersed, watching the sun climb higher into a clean blue sky. They were exhausted, bloodied, pushed to their limits, but alive. And they had done what seemed impossible. They had stopped a war. What will you do now? Marcus asked Takawin quietly. The chief touched the rope burn on his neck, a scar he would carry for the rest of his life. I will return to my people and tell them what happened here. I will tell them that not all white men are enemies, that some still value honor and truth. And I will continue to work for peace, though it will be harder now. The trust between our peoples has been badly damaged. But not destroyed, Sarah said. Not completely. We proved that today. We proved that truth can overcome hatred, if people are willing to listen. Takawin smiled, a sad expression that held both hope and resignation. Perhaps. Time will tell. He clasped Marcus's forearm in the traditional gesture of respect. You saved my life, old friend. I will not forget. And you saved mine. Years ago on the Canadian River, Marcus replied. We're even. The chief nodded, then turned and walked to where Gray Bear waited with horses. Within minutes, the Comanche delegation was riding out of town, heading back to their camps in the hills. Marcus watched them go until they were nothing but specks on the horizon, then turned to Sarah. That was a hell of a thing you did, showing up when you did. You saved all of us. Sarah shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I just wanted justice for Tom. Wanted to make sure the man who killed him paid for it. Never thought I'd end up stopping a war. Sometimes we're called to do more than we planned, Marcus said. Question is, what do you do now? Stay here, rebuild. Sarah looked around at the town, at the barricades being dismantled, at the people slowly returning to their normal routines. I don't know. This place doesn't feel like home anymore, not after everything that's happened. Maybe I'll move on, find somewhere new to start over. Could come with me, Marcus said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. I'm heading south, maybe to Arizona or New Mexico. Could use someone who knows how to handle themselves in a fight. Sarah looked at him appraisingly, her green eyes searching his face. You asking me to ride with you? I suppose I am. She smiled, a real smile that transformed her serious face. Then I suppose I'm saying yes. Thank you for journeying with me through this tale. If these words have touched something in your heart, I would be honored to hear from you. Your presence here has been a gift. The trial of Edmund Graves took place 3 weeks later in the territorial capital. The courtroom was packed with spectators from across the region, all of them eager to see the cattle baron face justice. Marcus and Sarah both testified, as did several of Graves' former employees who had finally found the courage to speak out about what they had witnessed. Takawin did not attend the trial, but he sent a written statement that was read into the record by a translator. In it, he described the deception that had brought him to Redemption Gulch, the staged evidence, the false conviction, the moments standing on the gallows waiting to die. His words were powerful and damning, painting a picture of calculated evil that left no room for doubt. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge, a stern man with silver hair and iron principles, sentenced Graves to hang for the murder of Tom Calloway, to be followed by additional sentences for conspiracy and fraud that would have totaled several lifetimes in prison had he lived to serve them. Edmund Graves was hanged 1 month later on a scaffold built in the same square where Takawin had nearly died. He went to his death without remorse, without apology, cursing the world that had failed to recognize his genius. No one mourned him. His empire was dissolved, his assets seized and sold, the proceeds distributed to those he had harmed. The Comanche land that Graves had tried to steal remained in the possession of Takawin's people, protected now by a new treaty that established clear boundaries and guaranteed water rights. The treaty was not perfect, and tensions remained, but it was a foundation on which something better might eventually be built. Marcus and Sarah left Redemption Gulch the day after the trial. They rode south together, two souls who had found each other in the midst of chaos and decided to see where the road would lead them. They didn't talk much about the future, didn't make grand plans or promises. They simply rode, day after day, through desert and mountains and vast open spaces that seemed to stretch on forever. Sometimes at night, when they made camp and sat by the fire, Sarah would ask Marcus about his past, about the years he'd spent drifting, about what had brought him to Redemption Gulch at exactly the right moment. And Marcus would tell her stories, some true and some embellished, about the frontier he had known, about the friends he had made and lost, about the slow transformation of wilderness into civilization and what was gained and lost in that process. And sometimes Marcus would ask Sarah about Tom, about what kind of boy he had been, about her plans for the future now that justice had been served. And Sarah would talk about her brother with a mixture of grief and love, describing a young man who had been kind and trusting and ultimately too innocent for the harsh world he'd been born into. She didn't know yet what she wanted to do with the rest of her life, but she knew she didn't want to spend it looking backward, dwelling on what had been taken from her. They rode through autumn and into winter, following the weather south into warmer lands. They worked odd jobs when they needed money, took whatever work was available, Marcus as a scout or guard, Sarah as a cook or ranch hand. They didn't settle anywhere, didn't put down roots. The road itself became home, and they were content with that. Years later, when people told the story of what happened in Redemption Gulch, the details would vary depending on who was telling it. Some said Marcus Blackwood single-handedly fought off an entire war party to save the chief. Others claimed Sarah Calloway had shot Graves herself in his office, executing him on the spot. Still others insisted the whole thing was exaggerated, that there had never really been any danger of war at all. But those who had been there, who had stood in the square that morning when truth faced down hatred, who had seen the rope burn on Takawin's neck and heard the rage in the crowd's voice before it transformed into shame and understanding, those people knew the truth. They knew how close they had come to destroying themselves, how easily manipulation and greed could turn neighbor against neighbor, how precious and fragile peace really was. Takawin lived another 20 years, long enough to see his grandchildren grow strong, long enough to navigate his people through the difficult years of change that came with the closing of the frontier. He wore the scar on his neck like a badge, never trying to hide it, using it as a teaching tool when young warriors questioned why he continued to seek peace with the whites. This mark, he would tell them, remind me that evil exists not in the color of a man's skin or the language he speaks, but in the choices he makes. It reminds me that justice requires courage, and that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. It reminds me that we must judge each person by their actions, not by assumptions or prejudice. He never forgot Marcus Blackwood, the man who had cut the rope and saved his life. Once a year, on the anniversary of that day, he would ride out to the canyon where they had hidden and spend an hour in quiet contemplation, offering prayers of gratitude to the spirits for sending him a friend when he needed one most. As for Marcus, he and Sarah eventually made their way to a small valley in New Mexico, where the mountains rose purple against the sky and a clear stream ran through land that no one had yet claimed. They built a small ranch there, nothing fancy, just a cabin and a barn and some corrals for horses. They didn't marry, didn't feel the need for ceremonies or legal documents. They simply lived together, worked together, built something together in the wilderness. Sometimes travelers would come through, and if they seemed trustworthy, if they had the look of people who would understand, Marcus would tell them the story of Redemption Gulch. He would describe the gallows and the mob, the rope and the rescue, the documents that proved one man's evil and the courage it took to stand against the tide of hatred. And when he finished, when the fire had burned down to coals and the night pressed close around them, he would always end the same way. Out here in the West, people say justice comes from the barrel of a gun or the knot of a rope. But I learned different. I learned that real justice requires more than violence. It requires courage to question what everyone else believes. It requires strength to stand alone against a mob. It requires wisdom to see past hatred to truth. The West is hard country, and it makes hard people. But it doesn't have to make cruel people. We always have a choice about what kind of person we'll be. The night wind would carry his words away into the darkness, and the travelers would nod and think about what he'd said. Some would remember, some would forget, but the story would continue, passing from campfire to campfire, changing and evolving with each telling, but always carrying that same core message about courage and truth, and the choice every person must make about who they will be when the world demands they become something less. In the end, perhaps that was the real lesson of what happened in Redemption Gulch. Not that good triumphed over evil, though it had. Not that justice prevailed, though it did. But rather that in every moment, in every crisis, each person has a choice. They can let fear and hatred guide them, can believe the easy lies and march with the mob, can sacrifice their conscience for the sake of belonging. Or they can do what Marcus Blackwood did. They can stand alone if necessary. They can cut the rope even when everyone else is screaming to tighten it. They can choose truth over comfort, justice over convenience, honor over safety. That choice exists in every moment, in every interaction, in every decision we make about how to treat each other and what kind of world we want to build. The frontier may be gone now, transformed from wilderness into civilization, but that choice remains. It will always remain as long as there are people willing to make it. And so the story ends where all true stories end. Not with a neat conclusion or a final answer, but with a question. The same question that faced Marcus Blackwood when he stood in that square and watched an innocent man standing on the gallows. The same question that faces each of us every day of our lives. What will you do when the moment comes? When the crowd is screaming for blood? When the evidence seems clear? When everyone around you is certain they're right? Will you have the courage to question, to investigate, to stand alone if necessary? Will you cut the rope? The sun sets on another day in the west, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Somewhere out there, in a small valley in New Mexico, an old man sits on his porch and watches the light fade. He's lived a long life, seen much, done things he's proud of and things he regrets. But he knows that on one day, in one moment, he made the right choice. He cut the rope. He stood for truth. He saved a life, and in doing so, saved hundreds more. That knowledge brings peace, the kind of peace that comes from knowing you did what was right even when it was hard, even when it was dangerous, even when the whole world was against you. And as the stars come out one by one, filling the sky with ancient light, he closes his eyes and smiles. Somewhere out there, the story continues. Somewhere out there, someone else is facing their own moment of choice. And he hopes, with all his heart, that they will have the courage to do what he did. To cut the rope, to stand for truth, to choose honor over hatred, justice over vengeance, courage over fear. That is the true spirit of the West, the spirit that built something real and lasting out of wilderness and hardship. Not the violence, not the gunfights, not the endless cycle of revenge, but the courage to stand for what's right, even when standing alone. Especially when standing alone. The West was won not by the fastest gun or the strongest arm, but by people who had the strength to choose differently, to build bridges instead of walls, to seek understanding instead of conflict. People like Marcus Blackwood and Takawin and Sarah Calloway, who looked past hatred and fear to see the truth beneath. Their story is finished now, but the lesson remains. In every generation, in every place, the same choice presents itself. And in every generation, there are a few who have the courage to make the hard choice, the right choice, the choice that makes all the difference. May we all have that courage when our moment comes. May we all be ready to cut the rope.